He was 60 years old on the verge of death, who run the Korean underworld with an iron fist. He was untouchable, and no one dared to oppose him, not once. Until the night bullets tore through Seoul's darkest alley, and Christine Morrow stumbled into the crossfire of his world. Han Sung-joon, the most feared mafia boss in Korea, threw his body over hers without a second thought. And in his final breath, weeks later, soaked in blood and fading fast, this man who had given everything to his empire made one last dying wish. Just one last kiss to the only woman he ever loved. Welcome to Black and Soul TV. Please like, share, and subscribe. Han Sung-joon had built his empire on one simple principle. Nothing and no one came before the Joseon clan. Not his health, not his reputation, not his hollow marriage to Yoon Sora, a woman who had stopped looking at him with anything resembling feeling 15 years ago. Not love, which he had long decided was a luxury designed for men who did not carry the weight he carried. He was 60 years old, broad-shouldered, silver-haired at the temples, with hands that had signed both contracts worth billions and orders that ended lives. He moved through Seoul's underworld like weather. You did not argue with him. You did not cross him. You simply moved out of his way and were grateful you still could. He had accepted the coldness of his life the way you accept winter. You dress for it. You endure it. You do not expect it to become something warm. That belief cracked open on a Tuesday night in Itaewon. He had just finished a quiet dinner with two of his senior lieutenants when the Dragon faction appeared from 3 directions at once. 12 armed men. A coordinated ambush. His soldiers drew immediately, and within seconds the narrow alley behind the restaurant became a battlefield. Civilians screamed and scattered in every direction. Glass shattered. A food cart overturned. The night split open with noise and chaos and the sharp smell of gunpowder. And that is when he saw her. She was pressed against the painted brick wall of a pojangmaka stall, completely frozen, a spilled cup of fish cake broth pooled around her sneakers. Her wide brown eyes locked on the barrel of a Dragon Enforcer's gun that had swung in her direction. She was not Korean. She was clearly American, curvy and breathtaking even in terror, wearing a yellow linen dress with a camera bag strapped across her chest that she was clutching like a shield. Her lips were parted. Her chest was heaving. She could not move. Han Sung-joon did not think. He simply moved. 4 long strides, and he was there, throwing the full weight of his body in front of hers just as the shot rang out. The bullet caught the outer edge of his left arm, tearing through the sleeve of his 300,001 suit jacket like it was paper. He felt the burn, but nothing deeper than that, because what registered first, what registered with a force that had nothing to do with pain, was her hands. Both of them, gripping the lapels of his jacket with a desperation that said she understood she was holding onto the only solid thing left in the world. Her face was pressed against his collarbone. He could feel her breath, fast and shallow, warming the skin at his throat. The firefight lasted another 90 seconds. His men were efficient. They always were. When the last Dragon Enforcer went down, the alley fell into a ringing, smoke-filled silence, broken only by distant sirens and the sound of her trying to steady her breathing against his chest. He stepped back slowly and looked at her properly for the first time. She was extraordinary. Her skin was deep and luminous even under the dirty yellow alley light. Her natural hair gathered in a loose bun with curls pulling free everywhere like they refused to be contained. Her lips were full, slightly trembling now that the shock was settling in, and her eyes, when they finally met his, were nothing like the eyes of people who usually looked at Han Sung-joon. There was no political calculation, no fear of his name or his power. There was only raw, unfiltered shock, and behind it something alive and sharp and entirely unbroken. She said, in flat, certain, Cleveland-accented English, "You're bleeding." He glanced at his arm. The fabric was soaked through. "I'm aware," he said, his English carrying only the faintest trace of an accent. She blinked. "You speak English." Among other things. His eyes moved across her face, checking for injury. "Are you hurt?" "No." She looked at the wreckage of the alley around her, at the overturned stalls and shattered glass, and the men his soldiers were already quietly moving. "What just happened?" "Nothing that concerns you any further." He gestured toward his waiting car, which had rounded the corner the moment the shooting stopped. "My driver will take you to your hotel." She looked at the car. Then she looked back at him, and he watched her do something remarkable. She folded the fear back, tucked it somewhere behind her composure, and straightened her spine and became, in the space of one breath, someone who was not going to be handled. "I don't know you," she said. "No," he agreed. But my jacket just stopped a bullet for you. That should count for something. She held his gaze for a long, assessing moment. Then the sirens grew louder and she clearly had no better option, so she walked to the car. He followed. His lieutenant moved to join them, but Han Sung-joon stopped him with one look. He would ride with her himself. He did not examine why. Her name was Christine Morrow. She was 33 years old, from Cleveland, Ohio, in Seoul on a 3-week travel photography assignment for an American lifestyle magazine. She had been shooting the night markets of Itaewon when the world exploded around her. She told him this in the car in short, careful sentences, not because she trusted him, but because talking was clearly how she processed shock. He listened without interrupting, which was something he almost never did. She did not ask who he was. She already knew the type of man who traveled with armed soldiers and spoke to them with the quiet authority of someone who had never once needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. She was smart enough to understand the category without needing the label. When they reached her boutique hotel in Insadong, she stepped out of the car and paused at the open door. She looked at his arm one more time. "Get that treated properly," she said. Not a suggestion, a directive, issued with the calm certainty of a woman who said what she meant and meant every word. "I have people for that," he replied. "Good. One more second of eye contact, long enough to feel like something. Thank you for what you did." Then she was gone through the glass doors, and the Seoul night swallowed her, and Han Sung-joon sat in the back of his car without giving his driver any instructions for nearly 3 full minutes. His lieutenant called twice. He did not answer. That had never happened before in 30 years. The next morning, he told himself the decision to station a protection detail outside her hotel was purely practical. She had witnessed clan business. She was a foreign national with a camera. She was a liability that needed to be monitored. He ran through the logic 3 times before breakfast and found it completely satisfying. By noon, he had looked at the photograph his man had taken of her leaving the hotel with her camera bag slung over one shoulder and her face tipped up toward the pale Seoul sky, like she was drinking in the light, and the logic dissolved entirely. A few days later, she walked straight up to the surveillance car and knocked on the window. His soldier Beck called in a panic. Han Sung-joon excused himself from a clan leadership meeting, which he had never done for anything short of a crisis, and answered. "She wants to know who sent me," Beck said. Han Sung-joon was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. "Tell her the truth." "That I did." Han Sung-joon had built his empire for years with no strings of romance attached, abandoning his wife and everything about love, until Christine came into his life. Now he feels a spark he hasn't felt in decades. Would his empire crumble at the cost of a woman he barely knew? "Hit that subscribe button, let's dive in." There was a muffled exchange. Then her voice came through the background of the call, clear and unhurried. "Tell him I want to talk to him. In person. Today." Something that might have been amusement moved through him. Something that might have been anticipation. He had not felt either in longer than he could name. "Tell her I'll meet her for coffee," he said. 1 hour. The cafe on Bukshinaro. He arrived first. He was always early to everything. Control of a situation started with arrival time, and he had never forgotten that. But when Christine walked through the door of the small Hanok cafe 6 minutes later, wearing a rust-colored wrap dress and carrying her camera like a natural extension of her arm, he stood up before he realized he was doing it. He had not stood up when a meeting partner entered a room in 20 years. Men stood for him. She noticed. The corner of her mouth moved. She sat down across from him and folded her hands on the table and looked at him the way she might look at a photograph she was trying to understand. Studying him. Unafraid. "You've been having me followed," she said. "I've been having you protected," he corrected. "That's not your call to make. In this city, where my enemies now know your face," he said quietly, "it is absolutely my call to make." She was silent for a moment, processing that. "They saw me with you." "Yes." She exhaled slowly. "So I'm in danger because you saved my life." That is one way to frame it. She looked at him for a long time. "What's your name?" "Han Sung-joon." Something flickered across her face. Recognition. She had heard the name. Then, or at least the shape of what it represented. Most people had. But she did not pull back. She tilted her head slightly and said, "I'm Christine." "I know," he said. And then, because something about her made honesty feel less dangerous than it ever had, he added, "I've read your assignment brief. Your magazine is reputable. Your photography has won 2 regional awards in the United States. You've been in Seoul 4 days, and you've already shot material in 6 different districts." Her eyes widened slightly. "You had me investigated. I protect what matters to me," he said. And then he heard himself say it, and something tightened in his chest, because he had not meant to say it quite like that, and yet every word of it was true. Christine Morrow did not blush or look away. She picked up her coffee cup and took a slow sip and then set it back down and said, "I don't need protecting, Han Sung-joon." "That," he said, "is exactly what someone who needs protecting always says." She laughed. It was sudden and unguarded, and it hit him somewhere behind the sternum like a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for decades. Over the following week, they met 4 more times. Always in public. Always at his suggestion, though she never declined. He took her to a traditional market in Namdaemun, where she photographed everything with the focused hunger of someone who saw beauty as a personal obligation. He walked beside her and answered her questions about Seoul's history with a depth and specificity that surprised her. He knew this city the way you only know a place you have fought for, bled for, buried people in. She was endlessly curious and entirely unimpressed by his power, which was the most disorienting thing anyone had ever done to him. His wife had been awed by him once, long ago. His lieutenants respected him through fear. The women who had orbited his world over the years had wanted proximity to what he represented. Christine wanted nothing from him except honest conversation and decent coffee, and she gave back exactly the same. He found himself looking forward to seeing her in a way that felt juvenile and enormous, and completely out of proportion to anything a 60-year-old man running a criminal empire should be feeling. He did not know what to do with it. So he did what he always did. He leaned into control. He told himself it was manageable. He told himself he was simply enjoying her company. He told himself it would pass. It did not pass. Later that week, he arrived at the rooftop bar where they had agreed to meet and found her already there, laughing. A man was beside her, Korean, early 40s, handsome in the way men are when they know it, leaning into her personal space with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to getting what he went after. He was touching her arm. She was being polite, not encouraging, but polite, and the sight of his hand on her arm sent something volcanic moving through Han Sung-joon's chest. He crossed the rooftop in measured strides and stopped beside her, and the temperature dropped around him the way it always did when he entered a space with intent. The man looked up, looked at Han Sung-joon's face, removed his hand from Christine's arm, and excused himself within 10 seconds. Christine watched him go and then turned to look at Han Sung-joon with an expression that was equal parts irritation and something she was clearly trying not to find funny. "Did you just scare away my new friend?" "He was not interested in friendship," Han Sung-joon said, sitting down with the calm of a man who had done nothing wrong. "I can handle men who aren't interested in friendship," she said. "I know you can." He met her eyes. "I did it anyway." She stared at him. "You're jealous." "I don't get jealous," he said. And even as the words left his mouth, they were so obviously false that she simply raised one eyebrow and let the silence handle it. He picked up the menu. She laughed softly under her breath and picked up hers, and the evening moved forward, and he felt the warmth of her beside him like something he had not known he was cold without. The following morning, his intelligence network flagged something that turned the warmth to ice. The Dragon faction had identified Christine. They knew her name, her hotel, her assignment. They knew she had been seen with him multiple times now. In the hierarchy of the underworld, that made her leverage. That made her a target. Han Sung-joon called an emergency meeting with his 4 senior lieutenants and restructured the entire protection detail around her without telling her. 2 men on her hotel, 1 following her at all times. A secondary team rotating every 6 hours. He wanted no gaps. He wanted no moments where she was exposed. He did not tell her because he knew she would argue. And he could not afford her arguing right now. He needed her safe first. He could ask for forgiveness later. But Christine Morrow noticed everything. She was a photographer. Noticing was her profession. By the second day, she had identified the tale, and she called him. Not texted, called. And when he answered, she said, "There are 3 of them now. What aren't you telling me?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he told her. All of it. The Dragon faction. The threat assessment. The reason she had gone from 1 protection detail to 3. He told her in the same flat, factual tone he used in his briefings, because she deserved honesty and because he was incapable of softening things he believed she needed to hear clearly. She was silent when he finished. Then, "How serious is this?" "Serious enough that I'm telling you now instead of after I'd handled it quietly," he said. Another silence. "What do you need me to do?" He had expected anger. He had prepared for a fight. Her question undid something in him. "Stay close to my people," he said. "Don't go anywhere without letting me know first. And trust me, I barely know you," she said. "I know." A pause. "Trust me anyway." She exhaled. You have a very inconvenient way of making that feel like the reasonable choice, she said. And she agreed. 3 days later she was taken. It happened fast, the way the worst things always do. She had slipped the tail for 20 minutes, just 20, to photograph a sunrise from a bridge she had scouted the day before. She had thought 20 minutes was nothing. She had thought she would be back before anyone noticed. The Dragon faction had been watching her for 2 days, waiting for exactly that window. When Han Sung-joon got the call, his body went completely cold, and then completely still in the way that preceded the most dangerous things he had ever done. He stood in his office with the phone pressed to his ear and his eyes fixed on nothing, and he said, very quietly, "Find her. Find her in the next 2 hours, or I will burn every Dragon faction operation in this city to the ground and salt the ashes." He was ready to burn now soul for her, ready to get blood on his hands for the woman he loved. Would this love be the end of him? Would he finally find happiness in all his years? Hit that subscribe button and don't miss the tale. He meant it. Every word. His lieutenants knew he meant it because they had seen him do comparable things before. The entire Jongxian network mobilized within minutes. He found her himself. He did not stay at headquarters waiting for reports. He rode with his lead team, tracking the Dragon faction's known safe houses in sequence, methodical and merciless, until the third location yielded a van that matched the description his surveillance footage had captured. They moved on the safe house in Mapo with a speed and precision that left no room for anything to go wrong. Christine was unharmed. Shaken, furious, her wrists bound with zip ties, she had nearly worked free herself because she was, at her core, a woman who did not simply wait to be rescued. When Han Sung-joon walked through the door of that damp, concrete room, and their eyes met across the space, her composure cracked for the first time. Just slightly. Her chin dropped, and her shoulders came down from around her ears, and something in her face went soft with relief. He crossed to her in 3 steps and cut the zip ties with the knife he always carried, and then, without planning it, without thinking it through, he pulled her against him and held her there with one hand pressed flat against the back of her head, and she let him. She pressed her face against his chest, and she let him. And he stood in the middle of that wretched room with his eyes closed, and his heart hammering with a feeling so enormous it had no name he could access. They stayed like that for a long moment. Then she pulled back and looked up at him and said, her voice rough, "I almost had the zip ties." "I know," he said. "You had 3 minutes left on them." She laughed, and it was wet at the edges, and he felt it like sunlight. Later that night, back at his penthouse where he had insisted she stay rather than return to the hotel, she sat in his kitchen wrapped in one of his suit jackets and drank the tea his housekeeper had made without being asked. He sat across from her and watched her come back to herself in increments, the steadiness returning to her hands, the focus returning to her eyes. "You didn't have to come yourself," she said. "Yes," he said simply, "I did." She looked at him for a long time. "Why?" He held her gaze. A man who had never in 60 years said what he felt clearly, who had always hidden everything behind authority and distance and the carefully maintained architecture of power, looked at Christine Morrow across his kitchen table and said, "Because I could not have been anywhere else." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything they had not yet said, pressing against the walls of the room. She set down her teacup. He did not move. She looked at him the way she looked at the photographs she was proudest of, like she was seeing all the way through to the thing beneath the surface, and what she found there did not frighten her. What happened next was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet in the way that the most significant things often are. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, and he turned his palm upward and held on, and they stayed there in the kitchen of his penthouse with Seoul glittering 40 floors below them, while everything between them shifted permanently into something neither of them had planned for. The intimacy that followed belonged only to them, to the hours between midnight and dawn, to the space where two people stop performing safety and simply are. It faded to black the way a camera does when it has captured everything worth capturing. The following morning, she woke early and lay still in the gray Seoul light, and felt the full weight of what had happened settle over her like a wave. And then fear moved in behind it. The clean, familiar fear of a woman who has given something real to a man who might not know what to do with it. A man who had an empire and a wife and 60 years of life that had nothing to do with her. She thought about the way power worked, the way men like him moved through the world, taking up every room they entered, and she thought about what it would mean to want someone like that and be left behind by him. She got up quietly. She found her clothes. She gathered her camera bag and her jacket, and she moved toward the door. His voice came from the doorway of the bedroom. Christine. She stopped but did not turn around. Where are you going? He was not accusatory. He was not cold. He just needed to know. Back to the hotel, she said. Back to my life. To what makes sense. He was quiet for a moment. Then she heard him move. He crossed the room and came around to stand in front of her, not blocking her path, simply making himself present, and she looked up at him with everything she was feeling written plainly on her face, because she had never been very good at hiding things. You think I'll regret last night, he said. I think men like you have whole lives that don't include women like me, she said. I think what this was for you might be very different from what it was for me, and I would rather leave first than find out I was right. He reached up and cupped her face in both his hands with a gentleness that seemed almost impossible for hands that had done the things his had done. I have spent 60 years putting this empire above every person who deserved better, he said. My wife, my soldiers, myself. His voice dropped. I will not put it above you. She searched his face. Sung Jun. I'm not asking you for anything impossible, he said. I'm asking you to stay long enough to let me show you that I mean it. She stayed. The weeks that followed were the fullest of his life. He cleared space in his schedule the way he had never cleared space for anything personal, and he spent it with her. He walked through Jangbakung beside her while she photographed the changing of the guard, and he told her stories about the Joseon dynasty that made her stop walking and stare at him, because the depth of his knowledge about history and art and music was entirely at odds with the image the world had of him. He was more than his empire. He had always been more than his empire. He had simply never allowed anyone close enough to see it. She showed him her photographs one evening on her laptop screen, and he looked at them with the focused attention he gave everything. And then he pointed to one, a shot of an elderly man eating alone at a street stall, the lights of the city blurred soft behind him, and he said, This one. This is the best. She looked at him. Why that one? Because he is completely alone, Sung Jun said, and completely at peace. That combination is harder than it looks. She studied his face. Is that you? He was quiet for a long moment. It was, he said. She saved the photograph and printed it, and gave it to him the next day in a simple frame. He put it on his desk, where he could see it every morning. His wife, Yoon Sora, found out through the clan's internal network the way she found out everything. She called him on a Tuesday afternoon, and her voice was exactly as cold as it always was, which told him she was not heartbroken, only territorial. You're embarrassing the family, she said. We don't have a family, he replied. We have an arrangement. I will honor my obligations to it. I will not end what I have with Christine. The call ended. Yoon Sora's lawyers contacted his by Friday. He let his legal team handle it and did not mention it to Christine until the following week, when she noticed his distraction and asked him directly. He told her. She listened. She did not panic. She asked him what he wanted. You, he said. Whatever that costs. But the Dragon faction had not finished with them. The attack came on an evening in early autumn when the air had just begun to turn. Sung Jun and Christine were leaving a private gallery opening in Cheongdam-dong, surrounded by his security team but in a public space, which always carried risk. 3 Dragon faction shooters opened fire from elevated positions across the street in a coordinated ambush designed to finish what the first attempt had not. His team moved immediately, forming a protective perimeter around Christine, pushing her toward the armored car. Han Sung-jun moved to direct his soldiers, and that is when the shot found him. Not a graze this time. Clean and deep, entering his side just below the ribs from a second shooter positioned at an angle his team had not anticipated. He felt it the way you feel a car accident, a great force, and then a stunned delay before the pain arrives. He stayed standing. He kept directing his men until Christine was in the car, until the immediate threat was neutralized, until the last dragon shooter had been contained. Only then did he allow his lieutenant to take his arm and register what everyone around him had already seen. There was too much blood. Far too much. They got him to a private medical facility that the clan maintained for exactly these situations. The surgeon was the best money could access, and she worked fast and skillfully, and for 4 hours the outcome was uncertain. Christine sat in the waiting room and did not move. She did not eat. She did not let anyone take her home. She sat with her hands pressed together in her lap and her eyes fixed on the door, and she waited, and the waiting was the longest thing she had ever done. The surgeon came out after the 4th hour with an expression that said everything before she said a word. The bullet had done damage that could be managed but not reversed. There were complications. His age worked against him. His body, which had endured 30 years of a brutal life, did not have the reserves a younger man would have. He had come through the surgery. He was stable. But the prognosis for full recovery was not what any of them were hoping. Christine went in to see him when they allowed it. He was pale against the white of the hospital bed in a way that made him look like a different man, though his eyes when they opened and found her were exactly the same. Sharp, present, entirely himself. "You're still here," he said. His voice was rough from the anesthesia. "I told you," she said, sitting beside him and taking his hand. "I can handle more than you think." He squeezed her hand with what strength he had. The corner of his mouth moved. "I know," he said. "I just like hearing it." The next week was slow and measured and full of the particular grief of watching someone strong navigate the reality of limitation. He improved enough to sit up, to speak without effort, to hold conversations with his lieutenants about the transfer of certain clan operations to trusted leadership. He was not naive. He understood his body. He had understood at the moment the bullet found its mark and the warmth spread too fast and too far. He had been in this business long enough to know what too much blood felt like from the inside. He began settling things. Not loudly, quietly, the way he did everything. He met with his legal team about the restructuring of his assets. He met with his senior lieutenants about succession. He met with his personal lawyer about Christine, ensuring that her safety and financial security were arranged in ways that could not be contested or dismantled after he was gone. He did not tell her he was doing this because she would have argued, and he did not want their remaining time to be an argument. She spent every day with him. She brought her laptop and edited photographs beside his bed while he rested. She read to him in the evenings. Articles from the English-language architecture magazines he had collected quietly for years because he had always loved buildings though he had never told anyone. She brought him food from the Pojangmaka stalls he could see from his hospital window, the ones he could no longer go to himself, and she described each one to him in detail while he ate what he could manage. He watched her with the kind of attention a man gives to things he is trying to memorize. On what turned out to be the last clear evening, when the light outside had gone golden and the city was settling into its evening rhythm, he asked her to come close. She moved her chair beside the bed and took his hand, and he looked at her for a long moment without speaking, and she let him because she was learning by now that his silences were never empty. "I have spent my entire life," he said finally, his voice low and deliberate, "taking from this world without giving anything back that mattered. Power, territory, money. None of it survives me." His eyes held hers. "You are the only thing I have ever wanted that was simply good." Her eyes filled. She did not look away. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Anything," she said. And she meant it. He was quiet for a moment. His thumb moved slowly across her knuckles. "Can I have one last kiss?" A pause. The admission cost him something. She could see it in the slight tightening of his jaw, but he held steady. "I would like to. Before I go. Just once. Just one last kiss from the only woman I have ever loved completely." The tears spilled over. She did not try to stop them. She leaned forward, close enough that she could see every line the years had carved into his face, every mark of the life he had lived, and she cupped his face in her hands the way he had cupped hers that morning in his penthouse. She pressed her lips to his with all the tenderness she had, slow and certain, pouring into it everything she felt and everything she had not yet found words for. And he kissed her back with the fullness of a man who had been waiting 60 years to know what this felt like. When they separated, he exhaled slowly. His eyes were wet. He looked at her the way the very old look at sunrises they understand are numbered, with complete attention and no waste. "There," he said softly. "Now I have nothing left undone." She held his hand through the night. She was still holding it when he slipped away in the early hours of the following morning, quietly and without pain, the way only men who are finally at peace manage to go. Seoul woke up to an autumn Tuesday not knowing that Han Sung-jun, the white tiger of the Jongseon clan, the man who had ruled its underworld for 3 decades, had gone. The news broke by noon. The city's criminal networks went into immediate restructured silence under the leadership transitions he had quietly arranged. His legal affairs settled cleanly. Everything he had planned worked exactly as he intended, because he had always been meticulous, and death was no exception. Christine flew home to Cleveland 3 weeks later. She carried with her a hard drive of photographs that would become the most celebrated work of her career. Photographs of Seoul at every hour, of markets and palaces and alleys and bridges, and threaded through all of them, in the backgrounds and margins, in the quality of the light she chose and the angles she favored, the fingerprints of a man who had walked beside her through it all. The magazine ran 8 pages. The editor called it a love letter to a city. Christine knew it was something more specific than that. She returned to Seoul the following spring. Not for work. She had been named the beneficiary of a small gallery space in Insadong that a lawyer contacted her about 2 months after she had returned to Ohio. The paperwork listed the donor as an anonymous estate. She knew. She opened the gallery in April, when the city was covered in pale pink cherry blossoms and the air smelled like rain and new things. She hung her Seoul photographs on white walls and clean frames and invited people in and watched them move through the space with the careful reverence people bring to things that feel true. On the wall nearest the entrance, she hung one photograph larger than the rest. An empty chair at a street stall, the city glowing warm behind it. A cup of tea still steaming on the table, as though the person who had been sitting there had only just stepped away. She titled it simply, "One Last Kiss." Beside the title card, in small print, she wrote 3 words that served as the entire explanation the photograph required. He was here. 7 months after the gallery opened, Christine discovered she was carrying his child. She sat with the test in her hands in the bathroom of the apartment she had taken near the gallery, the same Insadong neighborhood where she had first arrived in Seoul, not knowing what was waiting for her. And she cried until she could not cry anymore. And then she laughed. And then she pressed one hand flat against her stomach and said, into the quiet of the room, to the presence she still felt clearly even now, "You absolute man." Even now. She named her daughter Sunghae. She raised her in Seoul, in the city that had changed everything, with the photographs on the walls and the stories ready for the day her daughter was old enough to ask. She would tell her everything. About the man who had given his entire life to an empire and discovered at the end what he had missed. About the shot that found him. About the last clear evening and the golden light and a dying wish that had nothing to do with power or territory or legacy. Just one last kiss from the woman he truly loved. And how in giving her that, he gave Christine something she would carry every day for the rest of her life. The knowledge that she had been loved completely, without reservation, without condition, by a man who had never loved anything completely before. That, she would tell her daughter, is rarer than any empire. That is worth everything. Han Sung-joon dies a peaceful death, with his one wish granted, experiencing love and what it feels like to be cherished. If you enjoyed the story, hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for more.